imagine you already have an application with authentication, whether it's a homegrown system or another identity provider. Now you also want to expose a custom MCP server so AI agents can take useful actions on behalf of your users. Today, I will be demoing how to keep your existing authentication system, but add proper MCP authorization, scopes, and user consent that is fully OAuth compliant using Descope's Agentic Identity Hub. Here's the architecture that we are going to be building. The MCP client, such as Claude, wants to connect to my MCP server, but when it tries to do so, it gets a 401 error because it does not have the right credentials, and it is redirected to the well-known configuration endpoint of the Descope authorization server. Once it hits that endpoint, Descope will launch the user consent flow. The first step in that flow will be to redirect to the login endpoint of your external auth system, and as a part of this redirect, Descope appends an external auth request ID as a query parameter. Once you successfully authenticate there, the backend of your auth will call the Descope external auth / complete API route and include that external request ID as a parameter, along with user information, so that the user can be provisioned in Descope to identify the agent. Then we return to the consent flow, where you can select which scopes you do and do not want to consent to the agent having. And once that is done, you will be redirected back to your MCP client with an authorization code. Now to actually call the tools, your client will exchange the code for an access token from Descope using the OAuth 2.1 authorization code flow with Pixie. So let's start by building out the user consent flow. So the identity of the user that the agent is acting on behalf of still comes fully from your existing authentication provider. Here I have a simple homegrown auth system, just some email and password login capabilities. And from this page, all I really need is the URL of the login endpoint. So it's the domain of my app /login. So let's grab that and we're going to need it later. Now I'm going to navigate to the Descope console and go to flows. Now here, there's already an existing inbound apps user consent flow out of the box. And you can either edit this one directly or create a new flow using that template. Inbound apps user consent. That's how easy it is to create this flow. And now I already have this template out of the box ready to go. As you can see here, first of all, we're checking if the user is logged in. If they're not, we're doing authentication through Descope, so sending an OTP or email, or doing social login through OAuth. And then once the authentication is done and we've verified the OTP, then we're using the consent part of this flow. So here's how the flow works. If consent is already granted for all the tools that we're requesting, the flow is just done. Usually though, consent is not granted and we're going to go down this branch. First of all, we're asking, is this app verified? If it is, we're going to go to this consent screen, which is going to list the name of your project and then the name of all of your scopes. And then you can click authorize and you can select or deselect the scopes that you want to include in your consent. If the inbound app is not verified, it's a very similar screen, but here we're going to have a warning that this is not a verified application. But the functionality of the screen is essentially the same. Then, once you grant consent for those checkboxes which you selected, it's going to update user consent through this action, and then the flow will be over. We are going to keep most of this, except now we want to authenticate using our external provider and not Descope. So let's get rid of this whole authentication section. Just break the links here, here, here. And we can actually just select all of these components and delete them. And now all we're going to do is add one action. So go to the blue plus, select action, and search for external authentication, include in the flow. Now double click on it to edit it. And this is where you include that login endpoint that I mentioned before. I just copy pasted it here. We can include some error handling if we would like, but I'm just going to select done. And now connect start to this component. And then upon successful authentication, connect it to this next condition. And we're going to save our flow. So let's see how our flow actually works. We can do so right from the console by clicking this blue run button. And as you can see, the very first thing that happened was that it redirected us to our external auth provider. And when it did so, it included this extra query parameter in the URL called external auth request ID. And in the backend of your app, you're going to want to grab this request ID and send it in the Descope API call that you're going to submit. Here, I'm going to log in like normal. And it's going to bring me back to my flow. As you can see, since we successfully authenticated, we got this user consent screen, and it's going to display what consents Claude is going to request, and then you can authorize, and then you're given a JOT token. Now you only have to add a little bit of code to your backend to make this happen. And though the specifics may look a little bit different depending on how your app is implemented, hopefully this will give you the right idea of what to do. So first, we're going to grab this external auth request ID from the search parameters. And then if we determine that the authentication was called by an external source, so is external auth flow, then we call this /API/auth/complete route and pass in our email, password, and the external auth request ID. And so this route, what it does is validates the credentials. So when you enter the email password in those text boxes, it checks that those email and passwords are correct, they correspond to an existing user. And if they are, so if authentication is successful, then we call this complete external auth function and pass in the external auth request ID and the user that just logged in. And so this is the function that actually calls the Descope API. And if you want to check out our API reference, it's /management/flow/external auth/complete. But as you can see, we are doing a post request using a bearer token authorization method. And the bearer token consists of the Descope project ID followed by the Descope management key, which you can find in the Descope console. And then in the body of the request, we're submitting this external auth request ID. The user login ID will be the email that the user logged in with. And then you can pass in other claims, such as email. If that email is verified, you can associate users with a tenant and roles. And you can also pass in custom claims if you would like. Now, if we go back to our Descope console, under the Users tab, you can see that after we completed that external auth request, this demo user is now showing up as a user in my Descope console. And if you open up their details, you can see that there is a user ID associated with them now, which is going to be important for the agentic identity part. They have a login ID, and if we had sent any custom claims, they would have also shown up here. So the final piece of the puzzle is actually protecting your MCP server. To do so, we're going to use Descope's Agentic Identity Hub, which offers you the ability to protect your MCP servers and govern how AI agents and MCP clients connect to them. Under Agentic Identity Hub, we're going to select MCP servers, and then create a new MCP server. Here we're going to do customer support MCP, and then you paste your MCP server URL here. So I have here, and I'm going to do the /MCP endpoint. This is where we're actually going to set the scopes that the MCP clients can request. So as you can see, I have a handful of different scopes. I can have some read-only scopes. I can have some more sensitive scopes like the ability to write tickets or issue refunds. And we're going to toggle off this mark as mandatory scope because we want to give the user the ability to either accept or deny these scopes. We can leave one of them mandatory so you can see what that looks like. But all of our scopes are done. And now for the MCP client registration, you can enable CIMD and enable DCR. So these are two different ways to dynamically register your clients. And now this is where we plug in that external authentication flow that we defined earlier. Under DCR template, you're going to select custom, and then the user consent flow, find that external authentication flow that we created earlier, and then select it. And here under session management, you can also edit the token format and different token properties, but I'm going to leave it as according to system settings. And now that's my entire server. So I'm going to click create. And that's how easy it is to protect your MCP server. Now, Descope is going to give this well-known URL that you can use to redirect your client to the authorization server, and a couple of code snippets. I personally created my server using fast MCP, so I'm just going to take these code snippets and paste it right into my server, and I'm going to be good to go. So now let's actually see this in action. So here I am in Claude. I went to Customize, Connectors, and I'm going to add a custom connector. Here's my MCP server URL /MCP. I'm going to add it. And now the reason it's giving an issue is because we need to authenticate first. It's kind of getting that error that it doesn't have the proper credentials. But when we click connect, we started our Descope consent flow, which redirected us to the external auth provider. Here we're going to log in. And now this is this list of consents that Descope is providing for us. Since it's not an admin, it's a regular user, I'm not going to let it write refunds or edit support tickets, but we can leave all the read-only tools available, all the read-only consents. I'm going to click authorize. And now we've redirected back to Claude, and here it's showing the list of tools that are available using the scopes that I approved. So if I ask it to read all tickets associated with customer with this ID, customer_001, so this is the ticket. But now if I ask it to issue a refund, you can see that it does not have the refund tool available. It doesn't have the proper permissions for it, so it won't even show it as an available tool. So if we go back to Descope console and switch the Agentic Identity tab, this is a full directory of all the clients that have connected to your servers. This is the last connection that we just initiated with our login. So as you can see, Claude logged in using DCR, and this is the associate user. So if we click this, this opens in the users tab the exact user that we logged in with. And you can see what user your agent acted on behalf of. And finally, you can see which scopes were granted to that client on behalf of the user. In this video, we learned how to add spec-compliant MCP authorization without changing your existing user identity stack, using Descope's Agentic Identity Hub's external authentication feature. Links to learn more and get started with Descope are in the description. Thanks for watching.